Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. If you missed out on our training session last week, here's a quick overview. So as a part of the Monarch sessions at Dodge and SMLI, we will tag Monarchs using tags from the Monarch Watch tagging program to support Monarch monitoring research. So today we are delighted to have Dr. Baum, the director of Monarch Watch, joining us today to introduce Monarch Watch's mission and their tagging program to understand the dynamics of the monarch's spectacular fall migration through mark and recapture. So a little bit about Dr. Baum. She is not only the director of Monarch Watch, but also a professor in the University of Kansas at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology with a PhD in etymology. And she's also a senior scientist at the Kansas Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research. Her research primarily investigates the effects of land use and management practices on pollinators, with a focus on native bees and monarch butterflies. She has worked with monarchs and pollinators in the Great Plains for more than 25 years, participating in numerous state, regional, and national working groups to promote pollinator conservation. Dr. Baum's work in research and Monarch Watch are deeply interconnected. She tags monarchs as part of her research and has even created a monarch way station at her own home. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Baum.
Thank you, Cynthia. So I am joining you today from Lawrence, Kansas, so on the University of Kansas campus, and I will share my screen. So I am representing Monarch Watch. We have a team of people that work together on the three main components. So we focus on research, which is our tagging program is a center of that, but we also focus on education and conservation, which includes on the ground restoration activities, in particular, getting more milkweed plants in the ground. So with that, I thought it might be interesting to kind of look at the history of tagging. So the Urquharts were the ones who started tagging monarchs, with the idea of wanting to find out where they go for the winter. And if you look at that picture in the upper left corner, at the very beginning of tagging, there weren't good adhesives and there wasn't a really good way to attach things to the wing. So if you look closely, you can see there's a little punch through the wing. So that way they could fold the tag over the wing and then it could adhere to itself, if that makes sense. So that was kind of the original way that tagging worked. And then I dug through our notebooks for different tags, and we're actually probably going to put together a blog post kind of on the history of tagging just within Monarch Watch. But and can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. So the little white tags here were the ones that they used back in 1992, which is the year that Monarch Watch started and the first year that they did the tagging. And this was developed by Chip Taylor, who's the founding director of Monarch Watch and who I just chatted with earlier this afternoon. And so they were just little mailing stickers. And so they printed on those tags. So those were from 1992. And then the ones that were color coded were from 1993. So it's interesting, if you look at the tags, they're a little bit more rounded. So the idea that the adhesive is going to work better if you don't have any as many corners as you would, with a rectangle or square. But then of course we've shifted to the circular tags more recently. I think the very first year, so back to those white tags, they recommended that people kind of gently rub the scales off so that the adhesive would attach to the wing. And actually looking through our tagging notebooks, I found a letter from a long-term volunteer who's still very, very active with us from back in 1992, where he's like, your adhesive does not work very well. So it's a challenge to figure out how to tag monarchs. So circular tags, and then working with the company to develop an adhesive that would go through the scales all the way to the membrane to attach really, really well, is what they ended up doing. And we do get people contacting us about being interested in tagging, other types of insects. Moth seems to be one of the more frequent ones, but they have many more scales, and so it's our tags would work well for them. But it's kind of interesting looking at the history of tagging and how tagging has changed over the years. But it all relies on volunteers and people tagging, monarchs all over the U.S. And we focus on the eastern population. So there are some tagging programs that work in the Southwest and in more of the Western monarch population. But we have people, all the way from Southern Canada down through the full migration route that work on tagging. With the idea that we can track where the monarchs go and learn more about them through the tagging. And so these are some of the Urquhart data. So some of the very early data on tagging, so pre Monarch Watch in some cases. And so originally, before they figured out where monarchs were going, they were getting re-sightings, within the U.S. And we still get those domestic recoveries as well that we report. But you can see kind of some of the dots and lines that connect where a monarch was tagged with where it was re-sighted. And so you can see the patterns over time. And then the colonies are in the sanctuaries in central Mexico were found in 1975. So here's the cover of National Geographic from 1976 that shows what some of those aggregations of monarchs look like on the overwintering grounds. So looking at the population size of monarchs, and so when you try to estimate the size of insect, that covers a very large range, it's very challenging. And so there's been efforts to focus on the overwintering grounds where they're concentrated in one area as a way of being able to count the monarchs. And so, and I think I've got all this again in a minute. So we're going to skip forward a little bit. So here's a image that shows what it looks like on the overwintering grounds. So they're in the oil mill fir trees, and the orange in the picture is monarchs, right? So then you have to figure out, like, how are you going to count those monarchs? And so when we look at the overwintering numbers, they're actually estimated in hectares, since most of the world focuses on metric measurements. And so it's an area, not numbers of monarchs. But we'll talk a little bit more about what the numbers might mean as well. And then this is what it looks like on the tree. So they call it shingling. So they're kind of overlapping or layered on the tree trunks and hanging from the branches. So very, very dense numbers of monarchs. And so there's been various studies over the years that have looked at trying to estimate, so how many monarchs are there per hectare? And so the most recent study was from a few years ago, and they looked at all the previous estimates and kind of came up with their best guess, which is 21.1 million monarchs per hectare. So that's a lot of monarchs, but not many when you think about, an insect and the long distance migration and all the hazards along the way. So we'll go back to that original graph. Again, hectares is going to be on the y-axis, and then the winter season in which they estimate the size of the monarch population is on the y-axis. So you can see the first year that they have good data is from 1994 and 95. So that was after Monarch Watch started in 1992. And so they'll go out and they'll find kind of the tree that's farthest upslope that's occupied by monarchs, and then they'll measure the distance and direction to the all the monarch trees around the periphery to come up with that area estimate. And so you can see the population has fluctuated a lot over the years. That's pretty common for insect populations that use the strategy of, laying many eggs. And so if you think about, a female monarch, She can lay a few hundred eggs in her lifetime, but then you think about how many of those are going to make it to adulthood. And there's been various estimates, but it's in the, like, if you think of 100 eggs, only a handful, if you're lucky, are going to make it to be adults. So there's lots of predators and lots of challenges for monarchs. But that also means when there's a good year and you have a good more survive, that the population can build up really quickly. So that's one of the reasons you see these big fluctuations in the size of the population. And I will say, oh, maybe I can get over to the chat now. I was having trouble seeing the chat. Okay. With the screen sharing as well. Okay. We're still good to go. So looking at those population size numbers over time, you can see there is a decline. It's thought that the population size was really high in the 80s and 90s. If you think about agriculture and common milkweed, the agricultural practices of plowing, might have actually helped the milkweed, that does well with disturbance. But then when we had the advent of Roundup Ready corn and soybeans in particular in the upper Midwest, where they're able to eliminate the milkweed from those crop fields, is when we start to see a substantial decline in the population. So the petition to list monarchs was submitted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in August of 2014. So that followed the lowest population size on record, which was recorded that previous winter season. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came out with an initial decision where they said the monarch, that listing was warranted but precluded. So what that means is they found evidence to suggest that the population needed support from the Endangered Species Act, but that there were other species that were a higher priority or that were in more immediate need of attention. But then they have to revisit that decision every year. And then the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, put the monarch on their red list in July of 2022. So originally they listed it as endangered, but then they received additional questions from scientists, and so they revisited that question, and they now list the monarch as vulnerable. But that's not related to the U.S. Endangered Species Act, so that's entirely separate from the U.S. listing. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will come out with a final decision this December. So it's kind of good timing to talk about monarchs. And so it's interesting if you think back to 2014 when we had the lowest population size on record. 10 years later, we had the second lowest population size on record. So that 0.9 that we had this past overwintering season is the second lowest size on record. But the population actually seems to be doing pretty good. So there were very, very few monarchs that made it to Texas. But there were some late cold snaps that maybe killed off some of the predators. And so the population actually did really well, and we had good numbers coming out of Texas. And so when that first generation is really good, there's a good chance to build up. And I will get to the weight of the tags here in just a minute. And so it's interesting, the way we receive tag recoveries is that the locals will search through butterflies. Typically these are going to be dead butterflies on the forest floor, and find tags. And then we have a lot of people in our network that some of those will visit the overwintering sites each year, and they'll buy the tags from the locals. But occasionally we'll get a picture, which is what this one is here. So you can see the tag in the picture. That was from January 22nd of this year. And the tags weigh about 2 to 3% of the body weight of a monarch. There's some more high-tech advances in recent years. There's solar tags now, but they're still really heavy relative to the size of a monarch, and expensive. So those are more like about 15% of the body weight. So it's not clear that wouldn't have more of a negative effect on monarchs. So the stickers are still, kind of the best way to go in terms of being able to have broad application across a wide range. So this shows some of the tagging data over the years. So of course the program started out small, and so you're not going to be able to read all those numbers, but I guess the highlight is that bottom right-hand corner where it shows we've had over 21,000 tag recoveries. So this has given us lots of good information about where monarchs are coming from and where they're recovered at on the overwintering grounds. And so if you look across the top of that table, that shows different sites on the overwintering grounds. And so there's some of the main ones, that they're located at where most of the recoveries occur from each year. So looking at the migration for monarchs, the overwintering sites in central Mexico are located down there where the star is, the blue star. And so some of the challenges for monarchs on the overwintering grounds have been deforestation of those overwintering sites. But there's been a lot of work in Mexico to limit that. But there's also bark beetle damage and other things that have thinned those sites that have created challenges as well. But the graph kind of shows we've got the western population of monarchs that will overwinter along the coast of California. And then I'm primarily focusing on the eastern population, which is the one that migrates all the way to Mexico. But you'll see they come up through Texas, and then disperse. So the first generation will be in Texas, or the southern or western portions of some of those adjacent states, and then they'll expand from there. So a good year in Texas is good for the overall population. And this also highlights the Corn Belt, which is where we see a lot of the production of monarchs occurring, and also where there's been a lot of loss of milkweed. So habitat loss, pesticides, herbicides in particular are another challenge for monarchs as well. Another big one would be warming temperatures. So one of the big cues for monarchs for the migration is temperature. And so when we have warming conditions, the concern is that we could potentially lose the migration if they lose some of those cues that they use to migrate. And there are some monarchs that have been overwintering along the Gulf Coast, potentially related to warming temperatures. So just a kind of another view of what the migration looks like and where monarchs are in terms of the different generations. And this figure is from Journey North. So we get lots of good data from Journey North. If you haven't looked them up, that's where you can submit first sightings. And they also have data in the fall, so people can submit roost sightings, so where there's aggregations of monarchs in trees as they migrate south, or peak migration, or in the spring you can submit your first monarch, your first egg, things like that. So lots of great data for scientists. But you can see when we get here into July, we're looking at the second and third generations. And then, that third or fourth generation is the one that's gonna migrate to Mexico. So that generation, those adults will emerge, migrate through the U.S., through Texas, down to central Mexico, and then those same individuals are the ones that come back in the spring, lay eggs and then die in Texas. But then we have subsequent generations that will continue north. So if we think about monarchs, the life cycle varies a lot depending on temperature, but they're going to be an egg for 3 to 8 days, and then a caterpillar for another 9 to 14 days. And then they'll be in the pupal stage, the chrysalis stage, for 8 to 15 days. And then the adults will live anywhere from a few weeks in the summer if they're reproducing, up to 6 to 9 months if they're the ones that migrate to Mexico. So for the larval stages, the eggs and caterpillars, they're going to need milkweed. Milkweed is their sole host plant. And then the adults will need nectar. And we usually think about them being able to use a wide range of different nectar sources, so we haven't worried about nectar so much. But we think one of the reasons the population was so low this past year was that there was a drought, all the way from southern Oklahoma down to central Mexico. So, if you do have a really extensive drought, then nectar can become more challenging. And that nectar is what they convert to fat that helps them survive the winter, and then also migrate north in the spring. So here is another view of a monarch egg, or a couple eggs on this plant. And then eggs, and then a blow up of the egg. So it's not actually round. It's, kind of more of a oblong pyramid type of shape, and it's got those little striations. So they're very, very distinctive eggs. And we'll see if my videos work. I thought it would be, so when the eggs are about to hatch, the top turns really dark, so black, and that's actually the head capsule of that first instar caterpillar. So you can kind of see its little mandibles poking out there as it chews. And then there's another one here that's kind of the side view of that little first instar chewing out of its egg. And then that last picture over to the right shows that typically the first thing that first instar caterpillar is going to do is consume its eggshell. And so that gives it some extra nutrients and other things, but it's kind of interesting. So they turn black right before they're going to hatch. And so you can see the little first instars chewing out of their egg. And then the way you tell the different instar stages apart is you look at the tentacles, the projections at the front and rear end of the caterpillar. So when they're first instars, and you can't see very well, but that the leaves over on the right-hand side have all the life stages, but you won't really be able to see the projections at all. But then the second instar, you'll be able to start to see the projections. The little knobs will be a little bit more pronounced. And then the third instar, the ones at the front will extend past the head capsule. Fourth is bigger, and then fifth is much, much bigger. So because they're caterpillars and their bodies are really squishy, you can't really go based on the size of the body per se. So we look at those projections at the front and head end of the caterpillar. And then a lot of times they've got kind of distinctive feeding patterns. They don't the large ones will feed towards the edge of the leaf, but a lot of the early instars will kind of consume more towards the center of the leaf. And so some different feeding patterns and different instar stages. So we've got a fourth instar over here, and I can't see very well on my picture there, but I'm thinking that's a second. Our I need a bigger computer screen. Or maybe a third, but you can also see the frass. So the caterpillar poop, we refer to as frass. So you can see that kind of grows. And a lot of times when you're out in the field looking for fifth instars, you might see the frass before you see the caterpillar. So you can see this guy kind of hiding out over here, but you can spot its frass ahead of time. And here's a few adults on flowers. So shifting kind of over to the adult stage. And the way you can tell males and females apart is the males have a scent gland on their hind wing. They don't actually use that. A lot of butterflies use that as mate attractant. Other things, monarchs don't, but they still have it there. And so it's a little bit hard to see when the wings are folded up. If you looked at the dorsal side, the back side of the wings, it would be more obvious. And I've got some more pictures coming up that show that. And so the female doesn't have that, and the veins of her wing are a little bit thicker, but usually it's the presence or absence of that scent gland, that pouch or dot on the hind wing. That's how we usually look at them. So here's some of the Journey North data. So that site I mentioned that you can submit sightings to, and I pulled this maybe on Monday. So it's pretty recent. So it kind of shows you the distribution of monarchs that's been reported. And they'll switch out their there are graphs and the data you can submit, I think, starting August 1st for the fall. So they'll have a change, but you can kind of look and see where monarchs are. Let's see. And then when you order a tagging kit, this is what comes in the mail. And we'll have we actually just finished our tagging newsletter for this year. So we actually print it out, and then we have a big, we have to stuff the envelopes ourselves. And we order a bunch of tags from a company we've been working with for years. So there'll be this will be the first year that I will have provided the newsletter text. So this one will be from me, but and there'll be a data sheet, but there's other ways to submit data as well. And so the first question we always get with tagging is, when do I start tagging? So it's based on latitude. So I've got the latitudes plotted out here on the map. And so based on your latitude, we have recommendations on when you can begin tagging. And so the idea there is just make sure you're getting that migratory generation and you're not getting ones that might still be reproductive. And typically most of the ones you're going to tag, they'll be freshly emerged. And so in particular, if you're rearing, of course, they'll be fresh. And so you can see the recommendation for tagging for when the migration will start. And then we also have some recommendations on the website about peak migration. So when you would expect to see the most monarchs, which is also by latitude. And so, and I guess you guys are somewhat close to 40 degrees north. So you would be down here, early to mid-September as well. So when you might expect to see the most monarchs. And then Journey North, so this is the peak migration data from last year. So you can kind of look, and you might, so the thing I find challenging about reporting peak migration, right, is you have to do it after the fact. But I don't know that that's what people do on this site, right? So you're kind of making a guess as they come through on when that might be. And then this is the fall roost data. So again, that would be where there's, and you typically, I think we tend to see more fall roost as they move a little bit farther south, in particular when you get to grasslands where there's not as many places for them to stay overnight. And so they're, trees being few and farther between, they'll tend to aggregate in some of those. And then, so we've got the paper data sheet. We also have on our website where you can go and download an Excel file. And of course, we prefer to get either the Excel file or the app. And then we also have the app where you can submit your tagging data. And so there's, if you get a chance to download the app, they actually have where you can even scan in your codes so that you don't have to enter your code for your monarchs every time, and location information and all of that. So it kind of streamlines it, but then you do have to have your device with you, or you could even enter it when you're done on a mobile device as well. And then just some other information that will be on the app. And I'll shift forward a little bit farther because we've got a little bit more information. So this would come with your tagging kit as well. But this is the dorsal side, when the butterfly has its wings spread out. And so you can see those pouches that the male has better. I always kind of say they bleed through to the other side. It's kind of like you took a Sharpie and made a dot, and it, kind of, when you're looking at the underside, but you do get more used to it when you start tagging, and then the female doesn't have that dot. And so that's what the pouch looks like from the other side. And then here's a view of a male and a female. So the male is going to be on the left side. And again, it's a little tricky to see from the underside of the wing. And then the female, her veins are just a little bit thicker, but she doesn't have that little bulge there. And then this is another one. And this is a trick one. Both of them are males that you can see. So, so you can see that this one I think is a little bit more obvious than the other picture. And this one too. So you can see the pouch, the bulge. So those would both be males. And then thinking about the placement of the Monarch Watch tag, you place it on the discal cell. So, and we always call it this mitten-shaped cell, kind of at the center of the hind wing. And when they developed the tagging program, Chip did some research to figure out like where can you place that tag where it's not going to negatively affect their flight. And so that was where they identified as the best location for the tag. And so, and this is a picture from actually, so I moved to Kansas from Oklahoma State University. So this was in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And this is one of the sites. Campus had these abelia bushes all over, and all of those are monarchs. And so I haven't found as good of a location here yet, but where you can just go out and flop your net over and get a couple at a time. And like anyway, so and so as a researcher, I take a little bit of a different approach to tagging because I get more data for the monarchs. And so if you look over that upper right-hand picture, those are glassine envelopes. They're kind of like wax paper envelopes. So when you're collecting a bunch, so we would collect a bunch because we wanted to measure the wings, we wanted to weigh them, and then tag them. And we also would test them for spore forming protist. And so it was easy for us to just collect a bunch, take them back to the lab, process them, let them go, go collect some more. So that kind of was our process. So so that would be some that I had collected. And this picture in the top middle here gives you an idea of how wing size can be quite variable, and that would be related to food availability. And also down here, when you look at the abdomen, you can see one's got a much thinner abdomen compared to the other one. So that's one of the reasons we like to measure the size of the wings. And we've got a particular, if you're interested, I could send you some information that shows where we measure kind of from that dot to the edge of the wing to get length and then width. And then we weigh them. So, we'll just put them in, we'll weigh the glassine envelope and, tear at the scale and then put the butterfly in there. And then you can see one tagged there as well. Okay. And so this is just some data from Oklahoma that I've collected over the years. And so I put sample size at the top, so the number that we've been able to catch and tag. So it kind of varies. 2020 was an interesting year. So when you think about the tagging data, it's when monarchs are nectaring, right? So if they're flying high, if the winds are good, if they're out of the north and they're pushing them south, they might not stop to nectar. So usually if we're trying to figure out what's a good day, what are going to be the great days for catching monarchs, it's when the winds shift and they come out of the south. So then the monarchs kind of stall out and they'll drop down and nectar. So they're not fighting those winds. So it kind of varies, but I color coded my weeks to kind of give you an idea of how the migration shifts from year to year. So it depends on, a lot of conditions, including the weather, the wind, things like that. So we would usually say for the area I was at in Oklahoma, you would say peak migration would be at the end of these light green bars. And I will say, the migration has been shifting a little bit later, with warming temperatures that kind of delay the migration. But you kind of see how it shifts. So actually this last year, 2022, was maybe the closest to kind of normal peak time. So a lot of it being later, 2016, quite late. And so kind of just when we collected monarchs each year. And then I've got the proportion female up there. So so the sex ratio for monarchs would typically be 1-to-1, as you would expect so it would be 0.5 you would expect. But you do tend to catch more monarchs that are nectaring than you would females, just by the nature, of how it works, and the timing. So you would just we tend to tag more males than what you would see for females, just based on ease of catchability and the nectaring and things like that. So kind of interesting as well. And so then this was a weight. So I took average weight, and this is just the male migrants weight by week that I plotted over time. But you can see it does vary depending on conditions and what resources are available. But quite substantially depending on the week. And we also think about males tending to come through early. So oftentimes we'll see males earlier on in the migration throughout the entire migration, but just early on, it's more male focused. And with that, I was going to highlight a few more things. We talked about milkweed and nectar plants for monarchs, and we also have a way station program. So where you can create a habitat for monarchs at your home or at your school. And at the end of the year, we'll open up some of our free milkweed programs. So we have a free milkweed for schools program where you can apply and get some flats of milkweed. We also have a free milkweed for restoration projects if you've got larger scale projects where you want to add milkweed, and all of those open up towards the end of the year. So you'd want to get your application in then. And so we actually have people that collect milkweed seed for us and send it in. And then we actually go out. We actually went, I'm trying to remember what today is. Wednesday, I think, to collect some Asclepias viridis seed, one that we don't tend to get many of for this ecoregion. So we'll want the seed to be from a particular ecoregion, and then we'll send it to nurseries. They'll grow it out, and we'll send the plants back to that ecoregion. So those plants are from seed that was adapted to that area. So that's another one of our programs. And you can register your way station as well. And we also do rearing kits for schools. And so I was actually just over at the lab earlier. We do what we call isolating. So we have some breeding colonies in our facility here. So we'll have eggs that will, when those, they turn black and hatch into the first instars, we'll use a paintbrush and we'll transfer them to these little 1 ounce I think they call them portion cups, but kind of be like what you would get ketchup in, at some fast food places. And then we'll ship them. We have this artificial diet that we'll ship them to schools for them to go through the life cycle as well. So those are some of the other things we do. And for thinking a little bit more about tagging and some of your programs, we do have a place on the data sheet to indicate if your monarch is wild caught or reared. And for rearing, we tend to not have as good of success rate from our recaptures of tagged monarchs that are reared. And so if you think about what are really good conditions for reared monarchs, you want to make sure they're exposed to natural light, as much as possible, that they're never out of food. I will say it's hard to keep them with food because, once they get to the 5th instar stage, they do eat a lot. Make sure you're cleaning out the containers. If you can keep just 1 per container, that's ideal. But I think, some of the rearing practices, if they're competing for food or out of food at any point in time, or they're not getting all those natural daylight temperature cues, can affect their likelihood of being able to make it to Mexico. So some other thoughts. And I guess I would just end, we kind of view monarchs as a flagship species, so monarch habitat is good habitat for a whole lot of other animals as well. And it's pretty easy to add in other animals depending on what you're interested in. Like one example would be quail forever, pheasants forever does a lot for monarchs because good monarch habitat is also good quail habitat. So there's lots of support from a lot of different groups. So they're an important part of the food web, in terms of pollination and biodiversity and contributing. There's lots of things that they're distasteful, but lots of things that also eat monarchs at especially those early instars. We also think about the importance of monarchs to people. I always say they're a great connector. So many people have a monarch story, of why they're important. And so, we hope with the rearing kits, every kid gets a chance to see monarchs as well. And then certainly, thinking about in Mexico, we always monarchs are associated with Day of the Dead, and that's because we always think of them ideally, they reach the overwintering sites, on the Day of the Dead. So, at the very beginning of November. So that's kind of where that connection comes through, because it connects very closely to their life cycle and their arrival on the overwintering ground. So let's see. So there was a question about if they harm the trees, and they don't, but it is actually interesting. Now I'm wondering, how much weight is that? Each individual one doesn't weigh very much, but when you add thousands, they could be quite heavy. But I have not heard of any negative impacts on the trees. And it's also interesting. You kind of think of the colonies in Mexico kind of being in one location, but they do actually shift and move some over the winter. So if it warms up enough, they'll kind of all move down to like watering sources. So they don't necessarily stay in the exact same trees per se. They can shift and move and kind of ebb and flow a little bit on the overwintering ground. So it's they're not entirely static, if that makes sense. So let's see. Um, I think I already talked a little bit about the weight of the tags, being, kind of that 2 to 3% of the body weight. And they're, I think last year was the first year they used some of the solar tags, but again, they're a much bigger percent of the weight, and very expensive. So I don't think they've had many that have made it far. And it also relies on, I think, lots of Moda stations that aren't available either. But yeah, so lots of interesting future research with monarchs as well. So are there more questions?
If there are no more questions, then we have a little Kahoot activity. If you guys don't know what Kahoot is, it's uh, a little online quiz competition style kind of games. I'm pretty sure many of you have played it in school already. So oh, I also want to mention that Monarch Watch also like has a lot of amazing programs, like Dr. Baum said, the Monarch way stations. So if you want to like start your own Monarch way station or native plant garden, you could always reach out to Raju or me, because ReWild has the community gardens program and we help fund gardens at schools. So if you're interested in that, that's definitely something you could reach out to us about. So are there any more questions? Okay, so if you have any more questions, you can always pop them in the chat. But now we could start the Kahoot. Please join using the code on the screen. I'll also put oh yeah, it just says join at. I'll put that in the chat. Okay, we have 12 questions, I believe. So the first question is, what is the purpose of the Monarch Watch tagging program? 1, mass rearing monarch butterflies to bolster their population. 2, studying the impact of predators on monarch survival. 3, understanding the dynamics of monarch migration through market and capture. Or 4, mapping monarch habitat to identify key areas for conservation. Okay, most of you got it. That's great. Second question, true or false? The monarch butterfly population has declined 80% or more since the 1980s. If you haven't joined yet or you got kicked out, you could always join with the game pin at the bottom. Okay, great. Which IUCN Red List category are monarch butterflies currently in? This one's tricky because they changed it from, so it's different now. Yep, it's vulnerable, but they will review their status in December, as Dr. Baum said, so we'll know if they'll still be vulnerable or endangered or some other category. Which is a cause of the monarch population decline? Poaching, pesticides, deforestation, climate change. There are multiple answers to this. Right answers. Okay, yeah, everything is right except for poaching. Although some states have banned it because monarchs have become vulnerable, but these are the three main factors. Okay, so is the monarch butterfly on the right male or female? So you have to look at the picture. Okay, it's male because it has the two little coaches, as Dr. Baum said. Okay. Where do eastern monarch butterflies spend their winter? Canada, US, Australia, Mexico. Yep, Mexico. Uh, which egg belongs to a monarch butterfly? So you have to look at the picture for this one. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Yep, most of you got it. It's 3. If you're curious about what the other ones are, this one is visceroid butterfly, this one's white cabbage, and this one is black swallowtail. And you can see this one's a monarch butterfly because it has a kind of oval shape with the little vertical lines. Which instar stage is this monarch caterpillar at? So you have to look at the image for this one too. 1, 2, 4, or 5. The clue is to look at whether there are projections on the caterpillar. Yep, it's 1 because at the first instar stage, the projections haven't grown out yet. Okay, monarch larvae or caterpillars only eat which plant? Grass, coneflower, parsley, or milkweed? Oh, all of you got it. Where do you place a Monarch Watch tag? Onto the pouch, the dot on the hindwing that differentiates male or female, center of the hindwing, on the discal cell or the mitten-shaped cell, or on top of the abdomen. Yep, it's the center of the hyming on the discal cell, the mitten-shaped cell, which is this one over here, because it kind of looks like a mitten. Connor's in the lead. Okay. Around how many tagged monarchs have been recovered in Mexico? 200, 2,000, 20,000, or 200,000? Yep, it's 20,000. Yeah. Okay, last question. Why are monarch butterflies important? They serve as a food source, they represent cultural symbols, they contribute to biodiversity, they pollinate flowers. All of them are correct. Okay, let's see. The leaderboard. Third place, we have Ryan. Second place, Connor. In first place, Max. And for fourth and fifth place, we have Bella and Eugen. And also congratulations to everyone else.
Yay, Max.